today I have the great pleasure of bringing on my professor, Dr. Lauron Kehrer, Assistant Professor of Ethnomusicology and Musicology at Western Michigan University. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
How are you?
I'm good.
There's
You
something so
know,
genuine about that.
it's we are like what 18 months into a pandemic, and I'm gonna tell you all, I'm happy to be here, but in general, if I never have to do another Zoom again for the rest of my life, it'll be too soon. That's how I'm feeling.
Looking at a
Yeah.
computer screen all day is not the move.
I feel like we're at that. Are we like mid semester or close to mid semester at this point? Where
No. Who
no, we're
said
not.
that?
Yes.
No.
I have midterms next week.
We're
Yeah.
a third of the way into the semester.
And for public education, no, we haven't even hit 45 days of school yet out of 180. So,
Maybe I'm just
no.
trying to be positive. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to
I
get through.
try to be positive too.
So, on a
No.
positive note, we want to bring up that the Met performed its first opera written by a African American composer, and that was Terrence Blanchard.
Hmm.
Yes.
Um, Also a trumpet player, so you know it has to be good because it's a trumpet player.
Okay. Can we like first of all, yes, let's acknowledge the fact that this happened and it's amazing and the representation we saw on the stage and the representation we saw in the audience. Listen, we were showing up. Our people were coming for this and it was amazing from the reviews I've heard and from what people have been saying. But we at the same time let's also acknowledge that this is the first time we were seeing an African American composer on stage at the Met. That in itself is something to kind of think about. It's 2021. Why has this happened? Do we not have black composers who are who are writing operas, like, or were the people not ready for it is a real question.
That's the question.
We've been
Um,
on
One of,
discussions.
one of the things I think was kind of exciting about this, though, is that I think the Met realized that this was also an opportunity to sort of expand beyond their usual reach. So there is going to be a live simulcast of this opera in the theaters, but they also were doing events with the Schoenberg Center in Harlem and live streaming. And I think they did a live stream into Harlem at one point, which is I think really interesting to talk about, like if we want to think about what opera's reach is in 2021 and what it could be.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know, it's called Fire Shut Up in My Bones. If you want to go look it up and look at the synopsis and everything. But yeah, I think this is a way of taking it and putting it out to the people. And I think we've talked about this a lot about exactly like who are supposed to occupy these spaces, that these specific types of music are performed in, and I think that goes a little bit into the musicology, ethnomusicology, and the work that you do. So just tell us, like, give us some background on yourself and like tell us how like you got to Western Michigan.
How much time do we have? No. Well, like I was telling you before this, I actually started as a flute performance major. And so my background formally is I'm a classically trained musician. I did grow up in a household though where I was mostly surrounded by popular music, and I didn't know until I was in college that like you can talk about popular music in an academic setting. Like no one had told me that before. So once I realized that, I really liked performing, but I felt like the path to being an orchestral musician, it was so much of the same repertoire by the same handful of composers, and things have changed a lot since then in a really good way, but at the time it just felt like that's not really what I wanted to pursue. And at the same time, I was kind of getting into women gender studies and thinking about the relationships between social justice issues and music, and thinking about how I could talk about those issues through popular music is what led me to take a more academic path to my graduate work. So I did my master's degree is in ethnomusicology. Um, and my field work at that time was largely around women's music, which is women music for like, started in the 1970s around lesbian communities. There were a lot of, festivals, sort of lesbian spaces dedicated to creating a women's culture. And music was very much a part of that. So I was interested in that from a sort of historical perspective, but also how it had changed into the 21st century, like what genres were being represented, what types of women were being represented. And it was actually through women's music that I started to get into the study of hip hop and what is the role of LGBTQ artists in hip hop and why haven't we really put a lot of focus onto that. So after doing my master's, I took a year off and then I did my PhD in musicology. And I will say that through this whole process, I never had any coursework in popular music. I didn't have any coursework in, I did a graduate certificate in women and gender studies, but at an institute connected to my university, not actually in the music school that I was in. So, you do this, you kind of piece together the resources that you need from different places to make the path that you want in order to talk about the things that are meaningful to you. And so that's kind of what I did. I graduated, I got very lucky and got a tenure track position immediately in Virginia, was there for 2 years, and then took the job here at Western. So
And you just said something really big about popular music. To me, I don't think it is respected in the classical music arena. The fact that you went through all of your, degrees and there was not one popular music class that you could take. And I think that kind of lends itself to why classical music is, some may say, is a dying art because it's not connecting with the communities, these marginalized communities, or communities that are just like, that's hoity-toity stuff. That is above us. That does not resonate with, who we are. I mean, growing up as, a Black young boy saying, I'm going to, I'm gonna be in choir, I'm going to be in bands and, classical music, everyone is like, what? What is that? And then, actually getting to college, there is nothing about anything that I grew up listening to. There was no hip hop class. There was no R&B class. We had gospel choir, but that was it. Like that's as far as, classical music can digest, I guess. So I'm so glad that you are changing that field and really changing the way we teach the next generation. So can you explain some of those hardships you've had to kind of go through to now get that class and get it started up for the next people to learn?
yeah, I think having a sort of interdisciplinary background, I try to take that, what I put together and when I say this, I don't mean to say that I didn't have mentors. I had very caring mentors along the way that helped direct me. I just mean that the structures were not set up to do the kind
Right.
of work I wanted to do. Um, and my goal when I think about when I'm putting together a new class or what I cover in my class is I try to bring in all these different aspects of my background or things I think might resonate with students and like put them side to side like on even footing, right? Like all these things are important to talk about. Last year I was able to offer a new class, a graduate seminar, Black Music in the US. And I told my students, I said, this is a class that I wish that I had had when I was going through school. Like that was my impetus for putting it together and offering it. And, most of my students are also in, like Michael, in the classical world, right? So obviously I want it to be meaningful for you all. But I also want to point out that these things are much more connected than how we've been sort of trained to talk about them so far. So I'm really interested in making those connections, showing how they influence each other and sort of the shared social historical context in which music's being made and performed and listened to. So, yeah, go ahead.
And that goes to a great point that we're talking about. Like, there's this whole talk about classical music and about how orchestras have released all these statements and they still haven't changed. And we still do Beethoven 4 nights in a row and all this other stuff. And it's like people are calling to like cancel Beethoven or cancel all this stuff. And I'm like, we don't have to cancel it. We just have to and in both, but before and in both come, respect has to be given to both parties. And it feel like we've always had, it's like you always respect your older brother, but he's always going to pick on you over here. And that's like classical music with like popular culture music, because like, oh, this is for the mass media, blah, blah, blah. Well, they cover a lot more important topics in today's world than some of the classical music, and they resonate with everyone. And that's why it's still living. So it's like, how can we go into these communities with our classical music, but also take a turn on it and show and like not educate, but like combine the love of two for us and for the audience members that are not like, who don't want to go to a concert hall, who feel like they don't respond well in a concert hall because you have to be quiet, you just sit here. And then at intermission, everybody coughs their lungs out. And then you go back for a second half. So it's like, how can we do that? And I think it's where raising awareness in these classes for us, the next generation of musicians and educators.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot of interesting points about, I mean, first of all, I don't know anybody's trying to cancel Beethoven. I think we just need maybe a little less Beethoven. Is my feeling. But you know, like when I was playing in orchestras, it was like every cycle there had to be some Beethoven, there had to be some Strauss, and I was like, I love this stuff, but there's so many other things that we're not making space for by continuing to focus on the same things. And those things are not going to go away. It's just that there's so many things we're missing out on when you only program those things. Um, that's, you know, let's just put that to rest. Also, like, you know, if you have a Beethoven 250th anniversary and then you got to have a Beethoven 251st anniversary, I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
As someone who went to a Beethoven festival concert last night, which was just 3 nights of straight Beethoven, by the way. Um, it was hard to digest for a lot of different reasons, but the main thing is I was thinking, is everyone okay with this? And that's what scared me more than anything, was that it was just kind of, and then I kind of just looked about the sea of people who were specifically there, and I was like, yeah, in about 10, 15 years, his audience won't be here. Like, just to be honest, and I've said this so many times, like, whenever we talk about like pushing forward and social change within music, it's always like, oh well, like the audience, this, they want to hear this. I'm like, the audience isn't forever. Like, these are, unfortunately, I'm being, it's hard to, like, harsh to say, but it's very true. Like, we are the audience of tomorrow, you know. So what we want to hear is what we want represented on stage. So these institutions who are still holding this very old standard up, it's gonna go away soon. And like, I don't know if you saw the article. I think it was around September 20th, but the violinist Nigel Kennedy, when he was going to do a concert at Royal Albert Hall, he wanted to do a Jimi Hendrix tribute. There was a youth orchestra that was made up of all black musicians, and like, he wanted to do this popular music tribute, which is like, yeah, Jimi Hendrix is really important for American music, so why not? And then Classical FM said, yeah, nah. Instead, you can do Vivaldi's Four Seasons. They said that. They specifically said that piece too. And Nigel Kennedy quit. He said, I'm not doing the concert. Like, that's insane. And he called them a Jurassic FM, actually, whenever he was doing an interview about it. But it shows, like, and he said culturally prejudiced. He said musical segregation. He was using words. Like, he was very, I think he was shocked that still now in 2021, like, they would suggest, like, oh, that's just not, we don't think the audience is really going to go for that. We're going to go. And it's still, I mean, I'm not surprised, but I think the fact that there are people who are trying to push for popular music to become more integrated within like orchestras and to get more diversity within orchestras, like, there are people who are trying and we see them. But it's the institutions, that's the biggest thing that I think people are forgetting. Like, it's the structures and the systems that are in place that are, for the most part, keeping like these things from happening. And one of the questions I had was, like, are you, like, have you seen your fields, like ethnomusicology, musicology specifically, shift during your education, and what do you think still needs to be done? Because obviously there is a lot that still needs to be done.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No, I feel like actually I have seen a lot of change in terms of how popular music gets situated in those disciplines. Um, when I was first starting, it was really hard to find, like when you go to the big major conferences of the American Musicological Society or Society for Ethnomusicology, it was hard to find papers being accepted and programmed and presented on popular music topics. And I think due to the work of, we just have as you have newer scholars coming out who are doing that work and doing a really like doing great work, like you can't deny that it's, qualified to be presented in these same stages, right? I shouldn't say stages, these same conference rooms, whatever. Um, but it's also the work of people who are like-minded, getting together into like study groups or special interest groups and really pushing like, hey, there's a critical mass, there's an interest for this, there's, developing networks of people interested in these topics. One thing I'll say is that the process sometimes through which popular music studies gets legitimized can, in some cases, reinforce some of the same hierarchies that we see in classical music. It just gets reinscribed onto this, other genres. So, for example, some of the first folks in musicology to contribute to popular music studies were working on, groups like the Beatles and making musical theoretical arguments that would pull from the frameworks used in classical music studies and kind of making the argument of, hey, this music is also interesting because we can use these same tools, because we can do these same kinds of analyses. And I think one of the things that some of us are pushing back against is, not to say that that's not a legitimate approach, but we need to think about how not just what we study, but how we study it can reinforce some of those inequities, right? There's a lot of conversation in hip hop studies right now. I am a white scholar of Black music. A lot of hip hop scholars in musicology are also white or non Black people of color. And we have a lot of conversations about not just who gets sort of the opportunities to present and share their work and the mentorship that they need to be successful, but also like what tools are we using when we talk about this music? What frameworks? Like, are we coming at it from frameworks that have been used to privilege, white creators and white musicians? Or are we actually engaging with frameworks we need to study Black music that are originating from Black scholars, right? That are intentional in how we're analyzing and discussing some of this music. Because the danger is that if you're trying to legitimize something, you say it's just as good as this for the same reasons. We don't have to do that, I don't think. I don't think we have to do that. But I do think we need to be cognizant of this is important. It's important for different reasons, and we need different ways to think about it. But it doesn't make it less important than this. It's just different, right? So I think that's sort of a direction that we're kind of pushing now. Now that pop music is being taken a little more seriously. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting taken more seriously. We have to be really cognizant of what that means and what the responsibility is that comes along with that.
Um, I have something that you said, and it's something that I've noticed as well, that there aren't a lot of Black scholars writing on Black music. And in fact, I mean, I can only know a few. Do you have any, conclusion to why? Is it because we're just not in the music field to talk about it? Do you have any, hypotheses of why that is?
I think that there's actually a lot of Black scholars talking about music. They're just not always doing it in the disciplines of musicology and ethnomusicology. I
Mm,
think that there's what we call a leaky pipeline where people are being pushed out before they get to the point where they're contributing that scholarship. they're not necessarily getting the support or recognition that they need. And so that's something that we as people in these disciplines, people in schools of music, which is where, it kind of starts. This is where we really need to be focusing our attention to make sure that we're cultivating that, right? Like actively cultivating that. So it's not just, a handful of people that manage to get to that point where they're writing books, but actually thinking about, how do we just increase overall access, right? So that's what I say other disciplines, it's different. I think those of us who have music backgrounds have a unique perspective to talk about music, obviously. But we also historically have a really hard time cultivating Black scholars. And that's something that we all need to be working on from earlier stages, for sure.
Agree.
And that's definitely something that's a discussion topic that's been coming up a lot in one of my classes, that we have a lot of discussions just like this, where it's talked about where now it feels like diversity, equity, inclusion is all becoming like trend words for some people. Like it's like a fad to the point where people are just kind of using it to say, oh yeah, I'm this, or now I can put this hat on and everything. But then when we actually talk about, so how do we actually do more of this, and it gets to the conversation of more actual representation, meaning more people in the field who with like very different diverse backgrounds. um First of all, it's like you don't see as much of that conversation. And then on top of that, then how are those people who are people of color and who have more like diverse backgrounds, how are they treated when they're put into those situations and when they're in those institutions? Because um, I've seen so many professors who have talked about leaving positions because of the way they were treated. They feel like they were brought in to do more of that work, and then they were met with resistance, saying, "Oh, well, we don't really think about it that way. This, and this, and this." And so it's what you. I think what you said. I can't remember exactly what you said, but basically, like, um, people basically falling out before they get to this point of being able to, like, put out their research and do more research and do like more findings on it. It's because the systems aren't allowing for them to actually do what they like need to do in terms of research for like the backgrounds that they actually come from. So that's been a whole different. It's like not enough to just talk about it, but to have the people who that is their culture, that is their background, like just talking about it in these spaces.
Oh no, you can go. I'll go
I was,
after.
yeah, there's so much to talk about there. One of the things I want to say, part of the reason doing that kind of work becomes so challenging is because a lot of it needs to be led by people who are already marginalized, scholars of color, LGBTQ scholars, etc., gender diverse scholars. But in asking them to do that, we place an extra burden on top of the work that they're
Yes.
already doing.
Yes.
So, it's like a lose-lose situation in that, yeah, it's like these are the voices we need to be listening to, but they're straining for us to hear them, right? So how do we do that? And I think that we need to be all engaged in multifaceted approaches where it's not just one thing here, just focused on representation or just focused on mentorship or what. Like, we need to be thinking of it on all levels. I don't know who's going to be listening to this, but I kind of refuse to do diversity committees anymore because institutions will set up these committees and make it seem like that's the work, right? We have this committee, so we've done the work. They don't give the committees any actual power to do anything, to make any change. The work that needs to happen is done in every single other committee, right?
Mhm.
In your hiring, in your curriculum, in your scholarship. This is where that work actually is. And the diversity committees are sometimes just kind of a distraction and an energy drain. And so I personally kind of hate them, but I think we're not quite ready to get rid of them either, right? Because we're still at that stage where we at least need to have some conversation, and that's sometimes a centralized way to sort of have it. So yeah, this is why making changes at an institutional level is really, really hard. Not impossible, but it is really hard.
And to touch back on a point we said a couple of minutes ago, like not seeing some of these scholars visibly and how they're like straining to go out. Like we at KSU had one of the like Southern hip hop scholars teaching at Kennesaw State University, and I never heard of her until I got to Western Michigan University. That angers me to no end. Like Dr. Regina Bradley, like how she published a book in 2017 and then again last year or this year, and both of them are good books. I read the one this year, and I don't read, so that's how you know it's a good book for everybody out there. I do not read, and I read this book cover to cover, like period. But like the fact that she was at Kennesaw and none of the music people knew.
Yep.
Why is that a thing?
Yeah.
Like,
So Dr. Bradley is, first of all, it's like her book, Chronicling Stankonia, dropped in February 2021 because the release date was my birthday, so I felt like that was like especially for me, right? But just this week, she an edited volume called The Outcast Reader that she edited just dropped as well. So definitely shout out to Dr. Bradley's work. She is just the foremost scholar of Southern hip hop at this moment. Um, she's trained in English and African American studies, and that those are her home disciplines. And this is an issue. It's an issue with hip hop studies, but it's an issue with music studies more generally. Is I think again thinking about like the institutionalization of music makes it really challenging to do that sort of interdisciplinary work, right? And so I think that's one of the issues. I will say that I have been helping to organize the popular music section of the Society for Ethnomusicology has a keynote lecture every year at the annual conference, and I organized to get Dr. Bradley to be our speaker for this year. So, but that's what you got to do, right? You got to come in and say, "Here's an opportunity. How can I use that opportunity to make those connections for people and open things up?" So I'm super excited, super excited about it. It's
Hey,
the only reason I registered for the conference this year. So,
agreed, agreed.
but yeah, I think this is an issue of the way that, and also if you think about the way universities are structured, it's really challenging to do things on other parts of campus, right? And I think that's just something that music schools, especially, tend to be really less open. Music departments and schools of music tend to be a little less open to the kind of interdisciplinary connections we need. But that's another piece of the puzzle, right? When I say multifaceted approach, I think that's also another piece of that puzzle. Yeah.
And when my freshman year, I took African American Diaspora Studies class, and in that class, we talked about way more Black music than I ever did any time in any music class. When we had open discussions where we talked about some of your topics that you had in your dissertation, such as um, the changing of guard between Queen Latifah and Lakim, how Queen Latifah was looked at as more of the righteous, talking about the community, and everything. And then here's little Kim coming next, and she's, the feisty one, the one like that. So we discussed that in that class. I don't even honestly believe any of my professors know who Queen Latifah or Lakim was or who they are, and how regarded they are in the hip hop community. And that's just something that has become the norm. And I'm like, can we change this rhetoric? Because all of this is music. All of this has something to do with the students that are in front of us. And to this day, where we have the Nicki Minaj's, the Cardi B's, and some of the underground artists who kind of falls under that Queen Latifah style of rapping. I think we all need to study that as well. And which brings me to your dissertation that I found very interesting, where you talked about one of the chapters was, Nicki Minaj and balancing her femininity and her masculinity. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Whew, sure. That was a while ago.
Yes, yes,
Yeah. No, yeah, I think I have always found Nicki Minaj to be so fascinating. Like even when she's out here doing stuff where I'm like, no, what are you doing? I
yes.
still love her, right?
The recent things, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But I try to think of that as, one of the things that I'm very invested in my work is thinking about aspects of hip hop that have been considered on the margins and how maybe they're not as marginalized as we've been led to think that they are, and sort of recentering those things, right? So, my current project is focused on LGBTQ artists, Black LGBTQ artists, and how, and repositioning sort of queerness as more central to hip hop than how maybe we've been talking about it in the last 40 or so years, right? So with Nicki Minaj and other artists, not just LGBTQ artists, thinking about though how they have to contend with the way that we think of a stereotypical rapper or sort of normative rapper identity, right? And we've been taught, all of us, I think, through various media and various conversations to think of rap as very masculine, hyper masculine, but a particular kind of black masculinity that gets presented and that gets sort of upheld basically, especially through mainstream rap. Because also when we talk about rap, we're talking about a lot of different things, but in terms of what becomes most visible and most frequently heard and talked about. So when I think about artists like Nicki Minaj, they have to find a way to make themselves legible when they don't align with the expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that her strategy, like many artist strategies, shifts over time. So at the time when I was writing that, which was, I defended in 2017. So this was, you know, she has changed. She's done things since then. But one of the
Yeah.
things I noted is when she first came out, she was a little bit ambiguous about her sexuality. She kind of let people think maybe she was queer without coming out definitively either way, which is an interesting choice. And, kind of makes you like, for me, it raises questions about who does this benefit? Who does this maybe, erase in the conversation? I don't think it's a clear black or white, like good or bad thing, right? I think it's just worth thinking about what are the other factors going into this. One of the things I've been talking about with people lately is the way that she doesn't collaborate with other women rappers, right? She'll collaborate with women, like, she has a joint with Beyonce, but she doesn't collaborate with other women rappers. And one of the things I think is there's so much pressure on women rappers to
Mm-hmm.
find a way to make themselves heard and legible, that it seemed like one of her approaches was like, I am the woman rapper, right? Not just the best woman rapper, but I'm the woman rapper, which didn't really make space for other women. I think that strategy is less effective now. I'm looking at artists like Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B, who are much more open and understand that they can present themselves as part of a collaborative effort, not just like the one, right? And so that's what I think about Nicki Minaj is, but I also like don't hold it against her because the industry is set up in a certain way that you have to make choices, right? And how you want to situate yourself if you want to have this career. So I'm not mad at her. I'm maybe like disappointed sometimes, but I'm not, gonna hold that against her that those are the choices how she felt she had to navigate it.
Yes, and like what you just said, I always felt that female rappers have way harder, and to me, their music is way better, and it's because they have to fight so hard, and they have to come out on every stop to be better than their male counterpart. And so, to me, I would rather listen to me some Nicki or Megan or Cardi rather than your put rapper name here, whoever, because to me it's just more refined. It's just like yes. And also a point that you said, I've always called it digestible. Whenever I talk about LGBTQ as well, I always just say it's more digestible for the straight audience, or it's digestible for whatever audience, because it's easy for those people to just say, oh, you fit in this category. Fine, let's go on to the next. I can, in my head, I can digest that and I'm gonna go on. And one of my favorite people in the world, and she has had her shortcomings as well, and I've been a fan since the womb, is Miss Beyonce, which you've done some research as well on her. And I know Miss Beyonce Giselle knows Carter like the back of my hand. So please talk about that. And you actually had one of your works about Lemonade specifically, and the kind of selectiveness of queer representation throughout that. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying, like, sometimes as a scholar, you have to say things that are critical, and it doesn't mean you don't love it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because I feel like I was like a little nervous writing that. Like, is our Beyonce stands are the, is the Bayhive
The
gonna come for
beehive.
me? Right? But I critique out of love, right?
Yeah,
I critique
yes.
out of love. So part of the reason that I think you're referencing my article on queer resonances in Beyonce's Lemonade, and part of how that article came to be was I was doing field work in New Orleans in 2016 on bounce music. Bounce in New Orleans has a lot of openly LGBTQ rappers, which is still somewhat unusual for a local scene, right? And so I was there just trying to learn more about bounce culture and what was happening on the ground in New Orleans. Around the same time that bounce has started to become a little more well known outside, right? I'm thinking especially about the work of Big Frida.
Frida, yes.
Big Frida has become like a household name, which I'm so happy about. Like, and really like, oh, love her. So,
Yeah.
but there's a whole bunch of other rappers that don't have as much visibility as her, who are just as active and involved. And one of the things when I was there is, bounce music and dancing are like this. I know you can't see this on the podcast, but like intertwined, like inseparable, right? Dance and the music goes hand in hand. So I was really interested in all of these aspects and how they were combining and intersecting. And one of the things I was hearing was, when the music video for Formation came out, it was like a surprise drop, right? I still don't know how Beyonce gets away with these surprise drops, but
She's been doing it since 2013.
got on lock, like everyone.
Yeah.
So this video drops, and it's brilliant. Facts, right? That's not even opinion. That's just
Oh, absolutely.
right.
Absolutely.
And so it sparked a lot of conversation, like, oh, is she political now? Like, how is this reflective of our current, um, you know, about Black Lives Matter and all the sort of conversations we're having at a national level about social injustices and things like that. And it was mostly very positive, right? And the way she put that together, the folks, her team, put that together it was very powerful. But when I was in New Orleans, one of the things I was hearing is that some of the images and sounds and aesthetics that she draws on in that video are taken from Black queer communities in New Orleans in a way that were not necessarily credited or given compensation, right?
Mhm.
So we know that Big Frida was sampled on the track, and she was paid. She was credited. That she opened up the Formation World Tour stop in New Orleans. So she got her
Thank you.
flowers, right?
Yes.
But there's also a sample of the late Messi Maya, who's also a bounce artist and comedian.
Love Messi. Yes.
Yeah, Messi for a reason. Yeah, Messi Maya.
Messi Maya, love, love.
But, if you're not from New Orleans and you're not familiar with these artists, I think a lot of people didn't realize they were two different artists being
Yes,
sampled.
yes, they didn't know. They
Yeah,
didn't.
they didn't know. And Messi Maya's family, his estate, they sued Beyonce because they took that sample without credit, without paying for it. There was no clearance for that sample. And the politics of sampling in hip hop is really tricky because there's really sort of it raises a lot of questions about ownership of material, but also about like how do you give credit to someone if you're incorporating their work, and then like
Mhm,
when should you be doing that, right?
mhm.
And I think the issue with the Messi Maya situation is that, well, you know this was a really blatant, like, it's such an integral part of the song,
Mhm.
but there wasn't even an acknowledgement that this person who's now deceased was, their voice was being used on there.
Right, right. And on that, and Because I remember I was, I think, in seventh grade when I stumbled upon Messy Mike, like the actual video where they took the slice from. I'll never forget. He is walking with purple hair next to a Buick, and he's like, "You look like a Buick," and everything. And that's literally the next sentence is the cut that is in the song. And so I remember being like in seventh grade, all the way back, oh, child, a long time ago. I remember seeing that and then cut to Formation coming out. And I'm like, that's Messy Maya. Like, who, but no one knows Messy Maya besides me and my little friend group that knew who that was. People thought it was Big Frida. That's
Right.
who they thought it was because Big Frida at that time had already been had reality show, probably been on Drag Race at that time, like more of a household name. So most people thought about it. And I was like, no, that's Messy Maya. And then that made me go back and look up Messy Maya. Then I realized he had passed. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even know that. I remember years ago, this was the video because it was posted on YouTube. And that also gets a little, sketchy of, well, we're sampling a YouTube video and YouTube is public, I guess. I mean, technically, y'all, if y'all didn't know, they could take a relative pitch, splice it up, and put it in a song. Hopefully we get it, hopefully we get paid, but who knows? Like, how do you go past all of that? So definitely a very interesting thing that they had to do.
Well, and another thing is in the video, with permission, they used footage from a documentary short about Bounce that
Mhm.
featured some dancers and especially some of the young black gay men who've developed a really distinctive dance style that has incorporated, like, if you think about like shaking, which includes twerking, it's a part of
Yes.
shaking, there's really like very gendered styles, right? Where women's styles tend to be more like the twerking and more of, buttocks focused type styles of dance, which have West African roots. And men's styles tend to be more shoulder work and more footwork. Yeah,
Mhm.
you got it. You got it.
Mhm.
There's this group of especially queer men who like bring these things together, right?
Yes.
Who like
Yes.
twerk like the best of them are some of the most desired dancers that rappers will bring on tour. One of Big Frida's, if you watch especially the earlier seasons, her male dancer was, I told him he was my favorite, but he was like such a good dancer. So they were in this documentary, and then this is all legal that Beyonce's people got permission to use some of that footage in the Formation video. The problem is they got permission from the person who owned that footage. And
Mhm.
the artists, the dancers and artists included, had given their permission to be only in that documentary, right? Like they didn't give permission for it to be used in other contexts. And the thing is, they're Beyonce fans, right? Like, who wouldn't be thrilled to be featured in a
Yeah.
Beyonce video? Like, all they had to do was say, this is a dancer that was included, or hey, do you mind if we use this footage in this video? And they would have been thrilled,
Yeah.
thrilled, right? But the fact is, when you have all this sort of material by Black queer creators and you're not acknowledging that, there's an erasure that comes with that, right? So it's not just the like people want to get the money. I mean, that helps, right? But
Yeah.
it's also just about acknowledging like where some of these cultural aspects are coming from. And you're already talking about marginalized community. To have that erasure is just a really painful experience for them. So that's where the impetus for that article came from. Like, still love Beyonce, but
Right.
we can't like worship someone without talking about the ways in which there's been some harm there.
And I think other artists do it as well, where it is selectiveness with queer culture. That I'll hear a song and I'll hear Yes Queen, or I'll hear You Better Work, or something like that that is incorporated in their music, but then that's it. That's legit with no kind of, this comes from the queer culture. And especially, I had my problems and I love Drag Race, I really do. But how they kind of erased ballroom culture of New York for a long time, tens across the board, in which, because of Drag Race and how big it is, it's now become into music and it's become like normal vernacular for people. And I always try to tell people, I'm like, that comes from the ballroom scene, the ballroom in New York City ballroom scene. And I know you kind of talked about that before, with the ballroom, and really just a lot of our now normal words come from that scene as well. And they have also a very interesting music as well that they use for ballroom culture. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that just gets on my nerves is when this is where a lot of scholarship comes from, right? People have a tendency to do something that gets on your nerves, so you set out to
Yes.
to change the conversation. When we talk about queer rap artists, there's been a tendency to lump them all together as like,
Mhm,
they're
mhm,
already anomalies, is how the idea goes, and so they must have something all to do with each other, right? And what that
mhm.
does is it just completely flattens all the diversity of queer and trans rappers, right? That are working from different regional styles, approaching different topics, different musical style, all this stuff, right? So I was interested though that especially in sort of the early 2000, mid 2000, where are we now? 2010s? I don't know. 2010s, I guess. You have a group of openly queer and trans black rappers working in and around New York City who do have sort of shared approaches in their music, not because they're queer, but because they're drawing on ballroom culture in their music. And they're kind of using ballroom as an important touchstone, an important signifier of Black queer identity that they're then expressing through hip hop. And so you see them using some of the visual images, especially some of the competitive dance styles, right, in their music videos. Um,
Baseline of it all. Yes.
and a lot of ballroom, um, the competition categories, the gender competition categories have their own particular soundtracks, right? They have different styles that sort of articulate what the categories are. And so you see rappers engaging with those musical styles as well, and especially drawing on house music, which is,
Hmm.
like if you had to pick one sound to be really indicative of Black queer cultures, like house music would probably probably be it, right? So they're drawing on these musical styles, and of course lyrically they're engaging with some of that slang that you pointed out that's particular originates in those communities, about slaying, right?
Hmm.
Breeding,
Reading,
things like
right.
that, and
Wow.
they're
Yes.
engaging with that. So we're seeing this, but I think that hip hop audiences that don't have that cultural knowledge about ballroom are like they don't have a context for it, right? They understand it as hip hop, but not the sort of
Mhm.
um, other reference points that are being engaged in that music. And so that's something that I'm really interested in is how they're combining these things. And it's not that they're taking two things that are incompatible, right? Like hip hop and ballroom, I think already have a lot of overlap. They're
Yeah.
just making that overlap really apparent, like really clear, I think.
And my last question, how do we go, or how did we actually kind of transfer, and not really, the word isn't transfer, but from queer artists like Zebra Cats, or even I call her sometimes problematic queen, Azalea Banks,
How did I
to,
know that's where you were going
right,
with
you
this?
knew where I was going, you knew where I was going. How do we go from those to now Lil Nas X, where he is very mainstream and very open about being a member of LGBTQ?
I know. First of all, I love Lil Nas X. I mean, he makes me feel old, but like in a good way. you know, where I don't know that I could have imagined as, a young queer kid that we would be hearing Lil Nas X singing about like pretty explicit things
Yes.
on the radio. So that's kind of amazing. I will say though that it bothers me when media outlets position him as just coming out of nowhere.
Mm,
Because as we've already even gotten an idea from this conversation, there's a long history of not only queer involvement in hip hop, but there's a longer lineage of Black queer musicians in the US. And he I think is very much a part of that lineage. I
Mm-hmm.
think his visibility has made it so that we don't always make those connections immediately. And I
Yeah.
will say, I'm a little bit, I don't want to say like concerned, disappointed. He has a lot of amazing features on his first full length album.
Mm-hmm.
He missed a really good opportunity to collaborate with other queer rappers and queer hip hop artists. And so I'm a little worried, like the thing to bring it back full circle when we talk about Nicki Minaj and the strategies that she was engaging with and how, she didn't always, she wasn't the most collaborative artist in a lot of ways. I'm a little concerned that we're going to see that with Lil Nas X, that, he's like the gay rapper and kind of
Mm-hmm.
overshadow all these lots of other artists who've been doing this work but not haven't had the visibility yet that he's had. So I'm excited about it. It's a little, I have a little bit of concern about what that means for other rappers.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into I have a question that now is no longer a question, but it's answered, but now I have a follow-up question. So at first I was gonna just ask in general, are you seeing more representation of queer artists within the music field? And I think the answer to that is yes, but I think the what we have just been discussing is the fact that how they are represented and how they are credited for their work and their art is now becoming the topic of discussion and the issue that we are seeing. And so I think that's something to digest and for everyone who's listening to kind of think about when you talk about representation and diversity and inclusion, like who are you including? How are you including them? How are you representing them? Like, and are you trying to just lump all of the diverse people into one category? Are you actually like honoring everyone for their very specific diverse backgrounds? And yeah, that's a very, I think that's where we're going. I think now that like DEI is a very blanketed, like general idea, and now we're going, no, 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 there's more layers to this, and there's so many different ways we can take this and run with it. And just like you said, it's not one thing, it's not one committee, it's not one person who you appoint your DEI head. It is a system, and it's a like it's programs and other things that that have to be implemented and put into place for anything to actually get done. And so I thank you for the work you're doing and the things that the discussions you are bringing about, because this is the work that is going to turn into the things that we need to see in order to actually, if we want to talk equity, then this is the work to get there. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, but it's really, you all, your generation, you're doing this work, and I'm sorry that so much of it has fallen on you all, but and I see initiatives like this, and I get so excited because I just want folks to have an easier. I feel like the goal should be everyone coming after us should have an easier time than we did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I feel like that's the goal. One thing, if I can add one more thing about Lil Nas X, though, I know what I said was kind of just critical about him, but I also don't think it's his responsibility to make everything okay for queer youth and black queer youth in particular, right? And I think that that's not just for the artists we're talking about, but anyone involved in this work, is that it can't just be these superstars or this one person or whatever. That when we say multifaceted approach, it also means, more of us, like a sense of community doing the work.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. Thank
Yes.
you.
Aw.
Where can we find you? And where can people find all of your work and all the things that you're currently working on that are coming out soon? Like, let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, well, I am on Twitter. I don't know if I regret saying that.
Very active on
I'm gonna go
Twitter.
follow you right
I'll follow
now.
you right now.
At Lauron Kehrer on Twitter. I will post about, the book that I'm working on. I hope it's going to be out fall 2022. Um, I can't wait for it to be out, but, we got to make sure we're happy with what's going out. And my articles, I do, you know what? I do have a humanities commons account, but I have not updated in a while. But I do have some articles out that people can read, and I'm always happy to send PDFs because, access, access, access.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So
Awesome.
thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
being here with us. We have learned so much. This discussion has been so enriching. I can't imagine what it was like taking an actual class with you. So Michael, I'm jealous.
I know, right?
Thank you so much for sharing just like your knowledge with us and all the things that you're doing. So everyone go make sure to go check Dr. Kehrer out and look at all the amazing things that she is currently doing and will do later on. And we really hope you enjoyed the episode. Take everything, digest it, think about how you think about these things, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.